This is Sadie with Newfie Grandma Creates. I am currently reading Nancy Drew Mystery Stories, Book 1, Secret of the Old Clock. And I'm on Chapter 9. Helpful Disclosures. Nancy watched Abby Rowan intently as the mantel clock finished striking. The elderly woman's lips had begun to move. "The clock," she whispered. "That was it, the clock." Nancy gripped the arms of her chair in excitement. "Josiah Crowley hid the will in a clock," she prompted. No, it wasn't that," Abby murmured, sighing again. "I know Josiah said something about a clock, but whatever it was has slipped my mind." Silence descended over the room. Nancy was wondered what connection the timepiece could have with the missing will. Mrs. Rowan was staring at the clock, evidently still trying to probe her memory. Suddenly she gave a low cry. "There, it came to me just like that." "What, Mrs. Rowan?" Nancy heard quietly, lest she startled the old woman into forgetfulness. "A notebook," Abby exclaimed triumphantly. Nancy's heart gave a leap, but she forced herself to say calmly, "Please tell me more about this notebook." "Well, one day, not long before he passed away, Josiah said to me, 'Abby, after I'm dead, if my last will isn't found, you can learn about it in this little book of mine.'" "Do you know what became of the notebook, Miss Rowan?" "Oh, dearie me, there goes my memory again. No, I don't." Although baffled, Nancy felt a growing conviction that the whereabouts of the Crowley will was definitely tied up with a clock of some kind. But she pondered, why did the striking of the mantel clock remind Abby Rowan of the notebook? Impulsively, Nancy got up and went over to the mantel. She looked inside the glass front and in the back. There were no papers inside. Returning to her chair, Nancy asked the elderly woman, what became of the furnishings of the Crowley home when he gave it up? "The Tubbins got most everything. There must have been a family clock," Nancy mused, half to herself. "A family clock?" Abby repeated. "Oh, yes, there was a clock." "Can you describe it?" "It was just an ordinary mantel type, something like mine, tall with a square face," the woman told Nancy. "Only Josiah's was fancier. Had some kind of a moon on top." "What became of the clock?" Nancy questioned. "I suppose the Tubbins got it too." At last, Nancy, sure she had done all she could for Abby, and that she had learned as much as possible for the present, rose to depart. After saying goodbye, she stopped at the neighboring house and asked the occupants to look in occasionally on the elderly woman. "I think maybe one of the country's visiting nurses should see Mrs. Rowan," she suggested. "I'll phone the agency," the neighbor offered. "Meanwhile, I'll go over myself. I'm so sorry I didn't know about Mrs. Rowan." As Nancy drove towards River Heights, she jubilantly reviewed the new facts in the case. "Now, if I can only locate Mr. Crowley's notebook or clock or both." Nancy's brow knit in concentration. How would she go about tracking down the whole timepiece? "I guess," she concluded, "if the Tubbins do have the clock, I'll have to pay them a visit." While she did not relish the idea of calling on the unpleasant family, Nancy was determined to pursue every possible clue. "I can just see Ada and Isabel's expressions when I appear at their front door," Nancy thought wryly. "Well, I'll think of some excuse to see them." She was still mulling over the problem when she pulled into the driveway of her home and heard a familiar voice calling her name. "Why, Helen Corning," explained Nancy as a slim, attractive girlfriend of hers ran up. "I haven't seen you for days." I've been busy lately," Ellen explained, "trying to sell 6 tickets for a charity ball, but I haven't had much luck. Would you like a couple?" A sudden idea flashed into Nancy's mind at her friend's words. "Ellen," she said excitedly, "I'll buy 2 of your tickets and sell the rest for you." The other girls stared in astonishment. "Why, that's a wonderful offer, Nance." But Nancy's eyes danced. "I know what you think. I've lost my mind. I really mean it, though. Please let me take the tickets. I can't tell you my reasons yet, except my cause is a worthy one." Ellen looked relieved but bewildered. Handed over the tickets. "This is really a break for me," she said. "Now I can leave for my aunt's camp Avondale this evening. As I hoped, it's at Moon Lake. I thought I'd never get off with those tickets on, so." Nancy smiled. "Have a grand time, Ellen," she said. "How about coming along? It's not expensive and there's room for lots more girls. We'd have lots of fun." "I'd love to," Nancy replied, "but right now I can't get away." "Maybe you can make it later," Ellen suggested. "If so, just zip on up. I'll be there for 2 weeks before the regular summer camp opens." The two friends chatted a little longer, then said goodbye. Nancy put the car away, then walked slowly toward her house, looking meditatively at the charity tickets in her hand. "These are to be my passport to the Topham Strangles." It was the following afternoon when Nancy approached a large, pretentious house belonging to the Tophams. Bracing herself for what she realized would be a trying interview, Nancy mounted the steps and rang the doorbell. "Here goes," she thought. "I must be supple in this maneuver to keep from arousing the Tophams' suspicions." At that moment, a maid opened the door and with a condescending look waited for Nancy to state her mission. "Will you please tell Mrs. Topham that Nancy Drew is calling?" she requested. "I'm selling tickets for a charity dance. It's one of the most important functions of the year in River Heights," Nancy said impressively. It seemed ages to the young sleuth before the maid returned and said that Madame would see her. Nancy was ushered into the living room, which was so bizarre in its decor she was startled. "Such an expensive hodgepodge," Nancy observed to herself, sitting down. She glanced at the pink carpet, which to her clashed with the red window draperies, and at an indiscriminate assortment of period furniture mixed with modern. A haunting voice interrupted her thoughts. "Well, what do you want, Nancy?" Miss Topham had sailed grandly into the room and seated herself opposite Nancy. "I'm selling," Nancy began pleasantly. "Oh, if you're selling things, I'm not interested," the woman broke in rudely. "I can't be handing out money to every solicitor who comes along." With difficulty, Nancy suppressed an angry retort to the cutting remark. "Mrs. Topham," she said evenly, "perhaps your maid didn't make it clear. I'm selling tickets to a charity ball, which will be one of the loveliest affairs in River Heights this year." "Oh!" A slight change came over Mrs. Topham's face. Nancy sensed that her words had struck a responsive chord. The woman was well known for her aspirations to be accepted by the best families in River Heights. "Well?" To Nancy's dismay, Mrs. Topham's response was cut off by the arrival of Ada and Isabel. The sisters entered the room, but did not at first notice Nancy's presence. They were intensely carrying on a disgruntled conversation. "Really?" Ada was complaining. "I'm positive that woman snubbed us deliberately." Then she and Isabel caught sight of Nancy and stopped short. They stared coldly at the visitor. "What are you doing here?" Isabel asked with a patronizing air. Miss Topham answered her daughter's question. "Nancy's selling tickets to a charity dance, dear. It's to be a very important affair, and I think it will be very beneficial for us to be present." Isabel tossed her head disdainfully. "Don't waste your money, Mother." "Isabel's right," Ada chimed in. "We don't want to go to a ball just anybody can go to. We only attend the most exclusive affairs." "Absolutely," Isabel declared in her auntiest tone. "After all, Ada and I are very particular about the people we choose to meet." Mrs. Topham hesitated, evidently influenced by her daughter's argument. Nancy's heart sank, and she feared her cause was lost. She finally realized that Ada and Isabel would stay away from the dance just to spite her. As she debated what her next move should be, Richard Topham walked into the living room. He was a thin man with sparse gray hair. His manner was rather nervous. Mrs. Topham perfunctorily introduced Nancy to her husband. I gather you have some tickets to dispose of, Miss Drew, he said without ceremony. How many? Why, 4, Nancy replied in some surprise. I'll take them all. Mr. Topham opened his wallet with a flourish and drew out a $100 bill. Here you are. Keep the change for your charity. His daughters gasped and his wife explained, Richard, have you lost your senses? All that money? Listen, Mr. Topham retorted bluntly, this donation will entitle us to have our names on the programs as patrons. With his remark, he slumped into a chair and buried himself in the financial section of the newspaper. His family stared at one another, but they knew that the matter was closed. They never dared disturb him when he was absorbed in the stock market reports. Nancy arose reluctantly. She still had not accomplished the real purpose of her visit, but she had no excuse for prolonging her stay. How could she find out about the Crawley clock? Was it the one on the mantelpiece? I must be going, she said. Then, looking at her wristwatch, she pretended that it had stopped and began to wind it. What time is it, please? There's a clock right in front of you on the mantel, Ada said sharply. Nancy looked at the timepiece. So there it is, she remarked. Is it an heirloom? Perhaps the old Crowley clock I've heard so much about? Mrs. Topham looked down her nose. I should say not. This is a far more expensive one. Isabel also rose to Nancy's bait. Cousin Josiah's old clock was a monstrosity. We wouldn't even have it cluttering up the attic. Nancy's hope waned, but she asked quickly, Oh, then you sold it? No, Ada spoke up contemptuously. Who'd give any money for that piece of junk? We sent it up to our bungalow at Moon Lake. Moon Lake? The words hit Nancy like a thunderbolt. Not only had the Topham girl given Nancy the very information she sought, but Ellen's Cummings' invitation to Camp Avondale provided a valid reason to visit the resort. Now, if she could only figure out how to see the whole clock. As if Ada had read the visitor's thoughts, she said airily, We have some really fine pieces up at the college, Nancy. If you ever get up that way, drop in to see them. The caretaker will show you around. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything, Nancy said, trying hard to conceal her excitement. As the door closed behind her, Nancy grinned in anticipation. What luck, she told herself. Moon Lake, here I come. That's the end of chapter 9.